Magic record. Recording in progress. Okay. So, konnichiwa, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Cool, cool, cool. Sorry for the last minute. It's Wednesday. Most labs have seminar right now, so all the rooms have been taken up except 337. I had a class this morning in another room, and I didn't open the window, and the CO2 levels went like super high. Evidently my brain's still okay, but the university admin was all worried. So the result is we're doing this one online. Next class next week, we'll have it in 528 when 528's open. So that's okay. But today's an online special. And I'm going to eat some German cookies while I teach because they're delicious. I'm already growing. Okay, so everyone can hear me okay? Let's get into it. Once again, I've checked at all of my notes on bootcamp class. I think we have, after today, maybe 2 more classes. So 3 more weeks of classes and we should be finished, which is actually good timing, like a normal class, end of January should be finished. So let me share the screen. Let me go back up there. Go to share the screen. Ooh, I think this is going to work. Let's try this. Share screen. Desktop number 1. Maybe we'll try desktop number 2. Let's try that. And then let's try this. See if it's working, guys. You guys can tell me if it's working or not. Is it working? Presenter view? Yeah, okay, cool. Oh, and there's someone else. Oh, Kenta is in the waiting room. Let me let Kenta in. So bootcamp class number 5. Today we are going to talk about names more than anything. This is the part that's actually super fun, super easy, but this is a part of taxonomy where you could actually make mistakes and have your names erased or not used. And so this is something that's probably the most detail-oriented. If you're ever going to describe a species or give a species a name or a new species, erect a new species, this is the part that you really need to master in order to know well. So I know some of you are working on species that are potentially undescribed. From what I can see here, hang on, let me put all the people up there. Guichet, yes. Maybe down the line, Auguste will find something. Mari, for sure. She's got way too many species. So there'll be a lot of people out there that might want to use this. So let's talk. Oh, Nuria's in the waiting room. Just a second. Mouse, come on. There we go. Hang on. Okay, letting Nuria in. So again, reminder, ICZN. So I'm talking today about naming species according to the rules of ICZN. And this is basically for anything that's not a Symbiont, an ACA, or a protist, or an algae, or a plant, this is the code that we use. And just to remind you, ICZN covers these areas: family, genus, and species. Today, mainly, I'm going to be talking about species. I am going to talk a little bit about genus and family too. But as I've said before, and I will probably say next week, this is bottom up. So species is the unit. Everything comes from the species, from the type specimen. So today we're talking about naming species. Next week, we're talking about types. But everything comes up from the species. And so as I've just talked to you before, and just keep this in your mind, I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to tell you this many times. Species is a hypothesis. You want your research to be replicable. It's a living science, and things can change over time. The one thing that you really don't want to change is the name of your species. If you are going to the trouble of describing a species, if it turns out to be the same as another species, okay, fine, that's great. But you don't want to make a mistake and have your name disappear. And that happens a lot more than you'd think. So I want to talk about all of the detailed rules about how you can name a species today. That's what we're focusing on. So naming a species. There's a couple things. There's one easy thing that I use often, and I can tell if someone has really learned taxonomy or not. Let me move this over here. The most basic thing is, pardon me, when someone says the term, hang on, Emmeline's in here too. Just a second. Emmeline, okay. When someone says the term new species, oh, did you hear last week they found a new species? I mean, that's okay, and we all use that word, but that's actually not correct. The term new species, the phrase new species, this is especially for taxonomists in Japan, because we like to be worried about everything. This is the most sort of dangerous words. You might see it as sp or nsp, species novo, new species. It can be abbreviated. When do you see this term? When is it okay to use this term? When do you think? When is something new and when is it not new? Oh, I got a species for Christmas. It's new. Is that correct? Okay, so when can you use the term new species? Guichet has his hand up. He's not only asking questions, he's answering them. Guichet.
When it hasn't been like described before.
Okay, so obviously what you're describing, thank you, Guichet, you're correct. When the species you're describing is new, yes, you can use the term new species, but when? Like Guichet, say you're hanging out at the cocktail bar with Stefan, and you're like, yeah, I've got a new species. Is that okay? Casual conversation, who cares? But scientifically, is that okay? And Guichet, you don't have to be the only person who has to answer. Anyone, what do you think? Is it okay? Guichet, this is like a joke, right? Guichet, hang on. Oh, Kurt says, okay, with suffixes. Oh, we'll get to suffixes later. So you're sort of ahead of the game, Kurt. But let's say that Guichet and Stefan are at a bar. And Guichet says, I found a new species. Is that correct? Okay, if you think it's correct, put your hands up. Guichet says yes. Guichet's brave. Only Guichet? No, I can't see. You have to use the reaction button. I can't see everyone on my screen right now. It's not correct. Okay, so it's not correct. So when can you use the term new species? Anyone just tell me the answer, no worries.
Maybe when it's been officially accepted. I don't know.
Okay, so do you mean, Mari, last year someone found a new species? Is that correct? I think Mari's on mute, but she's thinking. You can tell she's
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, Guichet's got his hand up again. Guichet.
Can you say, oh, sorry, I hear me everywhere.
It's okay.
Instead of I found a new species, can you say I described a new species that I found?
Well, it's better, but not quite what I'm aiming at. The term, the words, new species. When can you use those words? Mari's kind of correct, but not correct. Guichet wasn't correct. Him and Stefan, lots of problems at the bar.
I think we have too many mojitos.
Yeah, so here's the answer, guys. No, that's not the answer. That's Zoom. Here's the answer. You only use the term new species in the paper where you're describing the species. If it's past that, you could say like past tense, they found a new species. That's kind of okay, but they described a species is much safer for things that have already been described. If Guichet and Stefan are at a bar and they're talking about the future, I found an undescribed species. No one cares about conversation, but when you're writing the term new species, if you put it in the title, that means you're describing a species in the paper. If it's in the paper, that means this is the paper where you describe the new species. Everyone makes mistakes on this. Mass media, scientists, everyone, even some taxonomists. But the official term new species, you only use in the original description when you're describing the species. There's other words and other ways to say it. There are some, and this is how you can tell if someone's a serious taxonomist or not. I mean, if I come in and say, oh, I found a new species, I mean, I might say that, but I would try to say, I found an undescribed species, or I don't know what it is, or something. But especially in writing, especially at conferences, especially in your presentations, if you're showing a tree and say, oh, yeah, this is a new species here, this is a new species here, and your paper's not published, you're wrong. That's incorrect. Guichet.
Hi, thank you. All of this
Yeah.
is written in ICC-NEM.
Yes.
Okay.
No. Well, yes and no. It's inferred, but I will explain it after. This comes to do with
Alright.
species names and rules of seniority, and I'm going to talk about that after. But basically, when you say new species, that's pointing the finger that this is new here right now. And so those terms, the term new species, conversation, okay, I'm not going to be the conversation police. I don't care. But when you're writing, you're only using this word in the original description and no other time ever. Okay, does that make sense? It's kind of very pedantic, very strict, but that's the rule. But let's get into naming, the fun part. When you name a species, traditionally, the species name was Latin or Greek. Because, well, Greek is not actually a dead language, Latin is, but most classically named species have been named Latin or Greek, or they've been made Latinized or Grecified, I guess you could say. But now, to be honest, there's a lot of different languages that you can use. So I've named species using Japanese language, using other local languages, using Palauan, for example. But there are still rules about naming a species. And I'm talking now about a species name, okay? And I want to talk about that a little more. So for example, you could name a species after a person. Let's say Guichet and Stefan are at the bar and they're like, you know what? I want to name this species after a goose. So I'm just looking at the people who are popping up on my screen. So if they do that, you could do that after a person. And what you do is you would take the person's name and you put an I on the end, a single I. It used to be 2 I's back in the day, but now it's 1 I. So for example, you could have Nanipora agusi. And that is basically the Nanipora of a goose, right? And so that's a way to give it after a person. First name, last name, doesn't matter. Always put the name and then the letter I, even if the person's name ends in the letter I. So Carletti becomes Carletti, right? For example. Okay, you could name it after a place. And you guys all know this, but it could be, oh, sorry, that should be a squiggly mark there, not an equals mark. Ensis. For example, maybe Kurt found a specimen in Chatan. And he's like, yeah, this is cool. Chatan, such a weird place. Chatanensis. There you go. It's done. The other thing is you could use an adjective, particularly Greek or Latin. Adjectives in Greek and Latin will end in the a or us, depending on the gender of the genus. This is where grammar becomes fun. We're going to talk more about grammar in a second. If it's a female, Latin has genders. It has neutral and male and female for a lot of words. And so if the genus name is female, then the ending for the adjective in Latin is female. If the male, or neutral. Basically, I try to avoid grammar as much as I can. I often use Japanese words or other language words, and I just say the gender is neutral. And then I just use the word as a noun, a genitive noun. If you want details on the grammar, look at some of the papers where we've described zoanthus species or zoantharian species, and it's usually a genitive noun or something. And that's just like a basic noun with no gender, don't worry. So you could have fragilus or fragila or fragilis, and those endings will depend on the gender of the genus. So sometimes You might have a species that was described as Japonica, and then someone moved it to a different genus, and the new genus has a different, is male, and so it becomes Japonicus. So the other thing is making sure that your name is the, is it the same or not, right? So when you're going through literature, anything that's ending in a or us, make sure, if it has the authorities in the parentheses, check the old spelling too, because some spellings of species names for adjectives can change. Okay. The reason, yeah, question.
10が入りたがってるかな。
Oh, there it is. Sorry, I was busy looking at my other screen. Okay. And
Yeah.
Agus has his hand up. Agus.
Okay, Sensei, thank you. For after a person, also we need to consider about gender, right? For the female,
No, this is always I.
I saw in the for female, like Woworai using I.
So the old traditional rules, like before, it was one I or A, but now it's almost always just I. So the rules have been sort of updated over time. The adjectives still have, because it's adjectives, but most other places it's usually not. Ensa, ensis. It's becoming, probably, honestly, in 10 years, even the adjective rules will go away because it does create a lot of confusion. I've got something here in the chat too. Hang on. Kurt Bachero.
Okay, Sensei.
Swiftney. Ah, Kurt, is this an example? Swifty. Ah, yeah, see, I guess you could, but if I was going to name it like that, they named it, so they named a species after Taylor Swift, and they ended it, oh no, so it would be I, single I now to start with, but they ended it as AY, and they probably have a reason in there that I'll look up after. So in other words, the rules for Latin and Greek and these endings are changing, and what's accepted is changing over time. But at the same time, there are some people who love taxonomy. Like, I like taxonomy, but I don't spend my time worrying about grammar so much. But there are people that will go through and look at paper and say, oh, this is wrong, and they'll change names. They'll say Swift A, incorrect, AY, incorrect, and they'll change it back to I or something. There's people who really like to do this, and it causes a lot of problems. So the safest thing to do is to make sure that no one can complain about your name. Taylor Swift, though, congratulations. Good job. Woo. I'll look at the paper after, Kurt. After I've done the PowerPoint, we can double check some of the rules. Okay, let's move on, because the other thing I said here was you want to look at whether this name has been used before, like Japonica, Japonicus. And I want to talk about that a little more, because when you name a species, it's not only important to know what the grammar is, if there's grammar, but also you need to know about history. And this is what I want to talk about a little more. Okay, so we talked about grammar, adjectives in Latin and Greek, check the gender of the genus, the generic name, right? There are some rules on grammar before making a mistake. For example, genitive nouns, things like that. In other words, do your homework before you just put a name on something. That's the basic rule. We'll talk more about this after, but okay. I made a spelling mistake here. Preoccupied name. So if you're working on a genus, let's see. If you're working on a genus, Ayaka, give me a genus name. Any.
I'm trying to cheat.
Yeah?
Who? Yeah, Palithoa.
Palithoa, okay. If you're working on Palithoa and you find a new species, you can give the species almost any name you want, but you can't give it a name of a species that's already been described in Palithoa. Okay? So, and that includes names that have now moved over into Palithoa. For example, Palithoa variabilis was originally described in Proto-Palithoa. So it's Palithoa variabilis with the parentheses. So if we find something new, say we go to Iriomote, we find, wow, some new or not new, undescribed. We find something undescribed from Iriomote. We want to give it a name. We can't give it the name Variabilis or any other name in Palithoa that's ever been used. So at the least, you need to know all the species that have ever been described, whether they're valid or not, in your genus. This is called a preoccupied name. Okay. There are lots of species that have the same names, but they're in different genera. Japonicus is super common. Gigantus, I named one Gigantus. There's like 20 million Gigantus out there. But as long as there's nothing in your genus, you're okay. But your genus includes past and present. So you need to really know the taxonomic history of your species and the ones that are no longer recognized, the invalid species, and how they've moved around. In other words, make sure your name hasn't been used before for the genus. For the genus, okay? It gets worse though. Genera. If you are naming a genera, if you find a genus, if you find a new genus, an undescribed genus, the name must never have been used anywhere ever for any animal. Plants are okay. There is a plant Spinipus and there is an animal Spinipus. That's okay. But you can't have two animals Spinipus. And also, this also includes fossils, which really sucks. So we named a species Hana, H-A-N-A, a species or a genus of octocoral, Hana, H-A-N-A. Turns out there is a fossil species with the genus name Hana. So we had to redo the name as H-A-N-A-H, Hana. And we had to write a small correction to that. So species names, it's for the genus, past and present, but for genera, for families, you really need to make sure that your name's never been used before. Or someone will come, the person who finds the mistake can give the new name. Someone could take your genus name away from you, give it a new name. The most famous is, I think like 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were these researchers, they found some fossil giant, like orca killer whales, and they named it Leviathan, which is super cool, but it turns out the name had already been used. So they had to change it to something else. It was like this huge, and it was in science, so it was really embarrassing. In other words, do your homework. That's preoccupied names. So you need to know the history of your names. Questions here before I get to the next one? The next slide? Anything's okay? Yeah, Ayaka-san.
So just to clarify, for species, as long as the genus is different, even if you have the same name, like between different genuses, it's okay. But for genus and above, it has to be entirely unique.
New. Yeah, absolutely.
From everything else. Okay.
Yeah. But also one qualifier for the species name, it's past and present for your genus, right? Because things have moved around, right? You want to make sure there's no confusion. That's another reason we use authorities with species names.
So if a genus, what if a genus name became like, I don't know, someone changed it for X reason. And
the only reason you change a genus name is if it's rude or if it's a complete and obvious misspelling of something, or it's someone else has already used that name for something else.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I got a question here from Stefan. Yes, what if you resuscitate, revive a species or genus? Totally possible. That's the other reason you need to know about all the species in your groups. So, for example, there was a Zoantherian genus named Bergia, and it was a group of Zoantherians that lived on sponges. And about, 100 years ago, they merged all of these different sponge-living Zoantherians into the genus Parazoanthus. And so everything became Parazoanthus. So the Bergia species and all the other species, they all became Parazoanthus. Of course, some Parazoanthus were in there too. But then 10 years ago, a PhD student in our lab he did a molecular analysis, and the Parazoanthus with sponges were beautifully into 3 different groups. One of the groups, one of the phylogenetic clades, included the type species of the genus Bergia, and it was different than Parazoanthus. In that case, we cannot make a new genus because the genus was already described and discovered 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So we revived. It was like back from the dead, like a zombie genus, right? And so now the genus Bergia is recognized and valid again. And that's that. So when you're doing phylogeny, and if you're using sequences of described species, and if you think you found something undescribed or new, like a genus, be careful, because you have to make sure about the taxonomic history of all of those species. If a species in your group was used as the type species for something different a long time ago that's disappeared, you have no choice. You must revive the dead genus, because otherwise you're redescribing something that's already been described. Okay, does that make sense, Stefan? Yeah, okay. It's actually pretty cool. Like, you know, everyone wants to find a new genus or something new, but I think actually reviving an old name is pretty cool. And it shows also that you've done your homework. So it happens. Any other questions here before I'm going to go on talk? There's still lots more to talk about. No worries. I think we're okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what if a species has been redescribed? And so this is what I mean. Let's say Stefan, sorry, okay, let's go to Kurt. We'll pick on someone else now. Let's say Kurt describes a species and he thinks it's new. Sorry, Kurt, it's okay, don't worry. And then later he realizes that the species was already described. In that case, your species is invalid, it disappears, right? So this is where the rule of seniority happens. So if one species has been described more than once, the oldest name takes precedent, almost always. There are rules where you can change it called a reversal of precedence, but it's rare and it takes an act. I'll talk about that after. So in taxonomy for species, genus, family, we have the rule of seniority. There we go, Nuria. Okay, going back. Okay, I'll answer that after in the chat. That's cool. See, they use it as a noun. So with seniority, you always go with the oldest name that's been valid. But the other thing is, if Kurt describes a species and then later on someone says, no, it's the same, and Kurt's name gets pushed into another species, the older species name takes effect. But maybe 10 years later, someone comes along, or Kurt comes back, and he's got new data. He's like, no, it's different. Then you can go back to the species name again. So this is what I mean. Even if someone destroys or invalidates your species, there's a chance in the future that it'll come back again. Just like what happened with Bergia after 100 years for a genus. So anytime you do taxonomy, even if you're not correct at that point and after, you make a hypothesis. It's correct. Someone comes, says, no, it's incorrect. Someone comes later, it actually is correct. That will bring your species back. Lazarus, right? So this is also another cool thing that I think, you know, as long as you're doing your best, I'm not so concerned. I mean, of course, we want our species to be valid, but mistakes happen a lot, especially with marine species with distributions that are wide or narrow. But I think it's okay. There's a couple things here regarding seniority that a couple tricky sort of taxonomic tricks. The first thing here is some people will say that the publication is not valid. ICZN has very vague rules on what is a publication. They say available to the public or in a library, and they say reviewed by peers, but they don't say much more. Sadokutsuki. There are scientists who have made their own online journal and they review their own papers. And they publish all sorts of crazy species names. But because ICZN is kind of vague, the publications are kind of valid. So it's very gray area. You could be a bad taxonomist and do lots of damage. There's one guy in Australia, I think he described 800 snake species, again, using the names he likes in his own journal. And yeah, there's idiots everywhere, right? But sometimes government notice or unpeer reviewed or something like that, just someone's PowerPoint presentation online, that is not a valid publication. So whenever you publish a species, it should be in a valid publication. As well, you should designate a type. We're going to talk about this next class, the specimens. If there's a paper that's not peer-reviewed and it doesn't designate types, someone might come and say, oh, this paper, this species name is garbage, let's throw it away. But again, the weird thing, well, not the weird thing, the cool thing, cool, weird, bad, I don't know. The interesting thing about taxonomy is no one tells you what is valid and invalid. That's up to each scientist. There are some scientists that don't recognize certain names because they're like, oh, that paper's garbage. I don't recognize that species. It's not accurate, but people do this, especially taxonomists. There's a list of some names that have been reversed, but outside of a taxonomic act, which we'll talk about maybe at the end of this class, it's your choice as to what you think is valid and invalid. But generally, you should be a scientist. You should not let your feelings get involved, and you should follow very basic rules, right? Valid publication, type designated, okay, cool, seniority. So those are the rules of publication, but there's more. You can invalidate your species in a publication if you use your name before you publish it. Don't use any new names in a talk, at a conference, or in your thesis before your species is published. Do not use the term new species. For example, if Mari has a super cool new species and she talks about it in her presentation and she calls it a new species and she gives it a name, and I record this and I put this on YouTube, she can't use the name in her publication. The first time you use the name of a new species is in your original publication. Does that make sense? In other words, you can maybe tell people at the bar secretly, but really guard, don't put anything in writing. As soon as you put, this is a new species and it's its name in writing, that's the description. If the description's not a peer-reviewed paper, you've invalidated your species before you start. One more chat here. Yeah, Kurt, I'll get to that. I'll get to that after in Worms. No worries. Mari, question.
So in a case like that, if you think you have a new species and you have a presentation, can you, for example, write genus SP if you think you have a new species, but the
Undescribed
No.
genus, undescribed species, safe.
but you can say that it's undescribed without
Undescribed is
specifying the name
undescribed is
being published.
yeah.
Ah.
Undescribed is completely different from new and totally safe.
Okay.
So yeah, Mari, what we might do, like you've got that massive, huge phylogeny, you might talk about undescribed generic level clades or things like that, right? Instead of new. Undiscovered diversity, things like that. Words like that are safe. Okay. And then we talked about before about peer reviewed and also type designated, right? Okay, we talked about that. So very quickly, one more thing here. Wait a second, hang on. I want to fix this. This part goes away because we already talked about that. So in etymology in your paper, where does the name come from? You need to be very clear about that. And this is where I want to use, for example, what Nuria just said. Nuria just put in the chat, Kurt's question on Taylor Swift name. Swifte, from the paper, etymology. The specific epitaph, the species name, is a noun in apposition. More specifically, an anagram formed from the name of the musician and global icon Taylor Swift, whose music has kept the first author energized and motivated through many late nights at the microscope. So it's a noun. It's not an adjective. It's named after Taylor Swift, but it's not the adjective. So it's not I, and it's not us, or it's not so they can use the spelling Swifte. So if you use a noun in apposition or a genitive noun and say this word is a noun, you're safe. You can give anything, you can give it any name you want. I've named species Uchina, which is the Okinawan word for the people of Okinawa, or Okinawa itself, Uchinanju, Uchina. And I said it's a genitive or a noun in apposition. So there's certain phrases you learn. Noun in apposition is a safe one. But if you say it's an adjective, you have to follow grammar rules. If it's a location, you got to do ensis. So you've really got to be, this grammar part, you need to talk to someone who knows what they're doing and be careful about it. I can help you. We can look it up. There's information online too. It's not bad, but just make sure you check before you just randomly give a name out. Okay. So that's where the name comes from. Okay. And then I said, of course, have fun, just like this Taylor Swift person, Swifte. I think names are a cool chance to either remember someone or to remember a location. I often, I like to do, adjectives of the languages of the country I'm in, but I say it's a noun. You can change it to a noun, right? And then, of course, please don't name it after yourself. There's a couple more quick things here. I'm going to copy these and put these on a slide and talk about them. Hang on. Let's get out of here. Get out of there. We're going to insert new slide. We're going to put this here. Boom. Okay, so this is from Stefan, I think, or was this Kurt? I think it was Kurt, maybe. So Worms lists valid, invalid, and unaccepted species. Okay. Valid is a species name that is currently being used and is valid. That's fine. Invalid is a species that has been found to be junior synonym. So someone else described it ahead of time, or maybe it was described improperly or something. A researcher has found that this species is incorrect due to taxonomic rules. An unaccepted species in worms means the authority of that group does not think it's a proper species for some reason or another. Unaccepted means the expert says, I don't agree, that's not a species. Invalid means it's out by the rules, and valid means it's in by the rules, if that makes sense. For example, there's a guy in the Canaries who's been making species and genera of zoantherians based on Cnidae, stinging cells. He might be right, but I think he's probably totally wrong. And he's erected all sorts of different taxa, but I just unaccepted, because this is garbage, I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. So this is what I told you about when outside of the rules, if you don't think something is valid or real, that's an unaccepted species. Is that okay for that question? And there's one more in the chat. That was from Kurt. Next one in the chat was here. Go back there. Okay. If nobody uses a species name, does that make it invalid automatically? No, not at all. A lot of taxonomy is actually people going back and finding species that were described that everyone just forgot about and realizing, oh, this is actually the species. And so with Acropora, with some of the species names, there's a lot of detective work, people going back and trying to find out when species were described. And actually, this species is not valid. This species is Brontosaurus apatosaurus for fossils, super famous dinosaurs. Elephants, 40 different names. People are still arguing over what's valid and invalid. If nobody uses a species name, it does not make the name invalid. It makes the people ignorant, and that's it. Is that okay? Okay. So what I think you can take, okay, and I'll come to you in a second, Mari. I see your hands up. What I think you can take from this is if you're really going to do taxonomy on a group, you need to know the history. You need old papers. You need to understand where the species have been described, where they're going. You know, you need to trace the history of all of these species over time in literature. And so collecting old papers and old PDFs becomes very important. Some groups are easy. Nanipora, Gishe is very lucky. There's only one species described in like 5 papers. Super easy. Mari's working on a phylum. There's millions and millions of things out there. And so it becomes much more difficult. So basically, yeah, start collecting all the literature you can for the taxa that you work on, the taxon that you work on. Mari, you had a question.
What happen if someone name a species but doesn't follow the grammatic rules? For example, there was a nematode that was described in Sesoko after Professor Sakihari,
Yeah.
and they call it Laxus sakihariye. So it's not.
So I'm sure, so it's Sakihari. It might be Greek, it might be a different ending or something. Probably the gender of the genus Laxus comes into play, and whether it's Latin or Greek, the guy who described it is a guy named Daniel Leduc. I think he knows his grammar and his taxonomy pretty well. But what I would do, the first thing you do if you suspect something is you would go look at the etymology. Look at the description of the etymology in the name. Usually the grammatical information should be in there. Then you check that against the rules. Yeah, looks okay. You know, if you really think that there's a mistake out there, then you can write a short comment and get it published somewhere. But usually that's kind of like there's people that do that, but I think it's probably taxonomy should be more about working together. I think if there's really a mistake on a name, the easiest thing to do is contact the author and say, you know, like, shouldn't it be this? And give them a chance to explain. And they might say, no, actually, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? I mean, the reason we give species names are so we know what we're talking about. And to me, regardless of whether the grammar is perfect or not, if we know what we're talking about in the authorities there, you know, I'm okay with it. Does that help,
Okay.
Mari?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. Gishe.
This is not a question. It's more like asking for your opinion, because when you say like you can name something out of a place, right?
Yeah.
It is a bit delicate because, for example, you see a lot of the Ryukyuensis, Okinawensis, even like Japonica. But for example, if you name something Agajimensis, right? And I think there are a few. And then like they find, I don't know, in Sesoko, right? So
Well,
that's
yes and no, because if you
a
name
bit
something
awkward.
after, I know what you're saying, right? It's not accurate, but it is accurate because that's the type locality. That's where it was first
okay.
found. And you don't have to name a species for its whole range. This is you know, this is Nanipora West Pacifica insis. No, you don't have to worry about that, right? You can, the person who names the species has the right to choose almost any name they want. There are a couple cases where you should be careful. You should be careful when you're using other languages to make sure you're not appropriating. Like we've used some Palauan words, but we asked our friends in Palau, hey, is this cool? And the head of the research station in Palau, is it okay to use this name? Particularly with First Nations or traditional owners, you want to make sure that you're not just being cultural pirates, right? But I think, you know, if your intention is good, it's usually okay. What else? I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, like we've got right now, we're describing 7 species from Western Australia. And we've used traditional owner names, but we've gotten permission from each of the groups to use the name. And we went through the West Australian Museum to do this. So if you're not sure, it's better to check and say, hey, is it okay to use this? I have a species in Canada named after a First Nations group there as well. And I talked to the council there about using the name and got permission. So if it's Japanese, I'm fine. I've been here 28 years. I feel like I'm fine using a Japanese name or an English name or a Latin or a Greek name because those are the standards. But if I'm going to use another language, I would always check and make sure it's appropriate. For example, we had a species that we were going to name that lived in a cave. We were going to call it Spelunkus, but in Portuguese, evidently it sounds a lot like toilet. So one of our co-authors said, don't use that name. Things happen. Now, there's one other thing, and I didn't make a slide. I'm going to make it right here in front of you. Watch this. There's one last thing you can do. If there are rules, there's rules about seniority, there's rules about publication. You can overturn rules in specific cases to promote taxonomic stability. For example, if this is sort of related to what Stefan had asked earlier. Are you guys looking at my PowerPoint or not? No, okay, let's go back there. Okay, right there. So you can overturn rules in specific cases to promote taxonomic stability. If, for example, the genus Epizoanthus, zoantharians that live in association with crabs and mollusks, usually in the deep sea. There is another genus, I think Cetiosia or something, that was actually described before Epizoanthus. Not the species, but the genus. No one ever used that genus name. And everyone used Epizoanthus for 150 years. And then we discovered that actually Epizoanthus is not the oldest name. The oldest name is something else. So you have two choices. You can say, okay, from now on, I will use the old name. Or you can write a paper and submit it to ICZN and say, we want to overturn this rule because everyone's using Epizoanthus and this is better for stable taxonomy. And then you make the case, and then the people on ICZN, every 2 or 3 months, they have a meeting, they vote yes, no, and it passes or it fails. And so these are called cases at the ICZN. So if there is something that you really don't agree with and you have reason, often you have to make a list of like 25 papers that have used Epizoanthus in the last 10 years. There's all sorts of crazy rules in there. I've written a few of these with Martin Lowe in Singapore to promote taxonomic stability. But you can overturn rules in specific cases to promote taxonomic stability. So, but if you don't, then you have to use the old rule. I have plenty of examples of this, PDFs as well. In the chat, Jem, original description of the genuses in the past was transferred to another family. The species I'm trying to describe will fall in a different family. But based on historical data, it belongs to the past original description genus. Okay, so this is a taxonomic problem, Jem. You guys can see Jem's question in the chat. Basically, the family needs to be redefined. Basically, the genus that you want to put it in is in a different family. I'm guessing the reason you know this is because you have molecular data. Is that right, Jem? Yeah. So this is the joy and the pain of DNA. It points out that there's huge mistakes in species, in genus, in family. So in other words, Jem, you can describe the species in a new genus or in that genus, but if you might need to go higher and reorganize the family or the genus. And this is what happens. You start with a species and you realize the problem's bigger than that. Does that help, Jem? Jem says maybe, maybe not. Jem's like, oh no, more work. Okay. I cannot see. Maybe Jim's writing an answer right there. While we're waiting, are there any other sort of what if questions or comments or rule things like that? Yeah, higher level of conflict.
I have other case, like it's imaginary.
Okay.
But so imagine, so we have Paletoa tuberculosa, right?
Yeah.
Imagine there was Phenopus tuberculosa,
Mm-hmm.
But then we know from molecular that Sphenopus are inside the Palitoa, and so Sphenopus tuberculosa should become Palitoa tuberculosa. But then there is already a Palitoa tuberculosa.
Yeah, yeah. What do you
So
do?
do
Okay.
you have to rename the whole name?
So what you would probably do is you're moving something into a new genus. Probably the senior tuberculosa stays tuberculosa. The other species, you have to find a replacement name for the species.
Okay. Mhm.
Okay. Yeah.
And sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Because so we also include the authority when we talk about the species, right? So I was wondering
So
if
you could
write Palitoa tuberculosa the year and then Palitoa tuberculosa parentheses year.
yeah, you could, but you really want to avoid having you want to avoid having two species with the same name in the same genus. It's probably way safer and more stable to have a replacement name.
Okay.
Okay, done.
すいません。さっきのジェムの質問、
うん。
理解しきれなかったので、日本語でもお願いしてよろしいですか？すいません。
OK。ジェムさんが、今、種を記載しようと思ってるけど、その種が入ってる属が、自分が持ってるデータと違うファミリーに移動されてるから
はい
どうすればいい？でも結局、分子データに基づいて、この属がこの科ではなくこの科とかそういう問題が出てきてるので、種の記載と関係ないなんだけど、おそらくカーダブルでも整理が必要になってしまう。だから分子をやると、結局種だけではなく属とか、科場合によってもうめちゃくちゃということがわかるので、どこまで整理するかということを考えないといけないと、あとその順番も含めて。
なるほど。すいません。ありがとうございます。
OK ですか？
OK です。
OK、ギシェ。
Hi. What are the rules or who controls the subspecies or population names? What is under what jurisdiction?
Subspecies are a plant entity in animals. They're not really used well. They're not used commonly. They are used for some more common species, but they're used basically to denote geographical ranges or populations. So usually a subspecies is found in a certain area. There are no rules. Most people would follow ICZN rules, just like they try to do that with order and higher level taxonomy as well. But there are no official rules for subspecies. Populations and stuff and varieties, plants only. Forget about it.
But so then when would you use a subspecies instead of just like different species?
I would never use a subspecies. It's the same or it's different. I mean, subspecies is just like, it's a different population. But if it's a different population, why didn't you just say it's a different population and not worry about a name? I'm not a big fan of subspecies because there's still linkages. If it's a different species, it's a different species. If it's still a biological species, a subspecies is still a species within, it's still part of the same of a bigger species, right? Species is a unit.
Then how do you actually prove that it's biologically same species?
Well, so that's the issue we all have. What is a species? Reproductive data, geographic data, reproductive experiments, molecular data, all those things you look at. But in the end, you can't escape human judgment. There's no way you're ever going to escape human judgment when it comes to species. Someone's going to have to draw the line. Most species are good. Some species are a complex or a mess. That's just life. That's what makes it fun. Shogunai, exactly. No, yeah, Kurt. So Kurt says most difficult question. In the end, for all of us, even if we're doing barcoding, even if we're doing like something else, you always come back to what is the species or what is this species? This is the unit we're working with. And so I think if you're pushing biology, you're studying biology, what is a species is something that we all have to wrestle with. And that means you're doing good science, good diversity science, I think. No worries. Okay, any other questions while we're talking about naming? Yeah, Guichet.
A species is a hypothesis.
Exactly. Species is a hypothesis, but you want to be correct. That's what we're all doing science, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. Next week, we're going to talk about types. And we're going to talk about, I think I've got still types to talk about. And then just a few other different types of taxonomic papers, and we should be good. Today, what I will do is I'm going to send you all a couple taxonomic act papers. They're like lawyer papers. They're very, very boring, but this is how you can overturn rules and stuff. I'll send you, hang on, I'm going to make a list here. I'm going to send you guys I'm going to send you a couple taxonomic act papers, and I'm going to send you a Lazarus paper on resurrecting something, bringing something back. Okay. I know it's very technical today, very exciting, and I apologize it's not in person. Next time we'll be in person, not on a Wednesday. We have a lab meeting at 4:30 today. We do have a room for the lab meeting, don't worry, and seminar. So see you all later. Otsukare-sama desu.